Latin names for plants are actually quite naughty. That's all I'm going to say. Just, if you know your Latin and you go there, make sure you realize, who made up that name? Because that's a little risque. But yeah. Paramecium vaginalis, just for instance. Yeah. But Linnaeus, just like I say, interesting guy, kind of weird, kind of cool. And you could write a very neat term paper on him and impress whoever you're trying to impress. The Latin thing. And where we're going in lab over the next few weeks is, you're gonna get a lot of that sort of pseudo-Latin, pseudo-Greek terminology. You know why it's done in Latin?
Because Latin's a classic language and it's got this structure built in and it's easy to add stuff on.
Well, not just that it's classic and structured, but that it's relatively unchanging. And when Linnaeus did this, by the way, see, when you classify living things, let's say you got a robin. In English, it's a robin. In French, it's something else. In German, it's something else again. In Japanese, it's something else again. If you use any particular language, you create a problem where a scientist in one part of the world could be talking about the same thing that somebody in some other country in some other language, and it's easy to imagine they may not realize they're talking about the same thing. So the need for a universal language where no matter where you live, that thing has that name, that's part of why Latin. Two other things about Latin that are worth you guys knowing. One is that it's, by the way, the cliche that they always teach when people do Linnaean taxonomy is that it's a dead language. It's there and it doesn't change. Think about, like, if you use a live language like English, probably a bad move, even if the whole planet spoke English. Because English evolves now, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Seriously. English as it's spoken in America now is different from English as it was spoken in America in my parents' generation. I mean, seriously, if I went up to my grandmother and went, WTF? And you see, in real life America, most people know what that means, you know what I mean? But yeah, English changes yearly and faster than yearly. And you don't want that in a language that is supposed to just describe things, the way they are, and the next generation of scientists will still. So you want a dead language. That's the main point. I'll say as an aside that Latin is not really dead. They're still inventing new Latin words. Did you know that? Latin is actually alive in that sense.
And there's also a population of about 10,000 people who speak Latin as a dominant language.
Who's that?
I don't remember my late life home.
Oh, because that's a surprise to me. But the example I wanted to offer you guys
is where words get added.
Latin is the ecclesiastical Latin of the Roman Catholic Church. And a couple incidents I'll relate to you. Back during the Vietnam War, President Nixon asked the Pope to bless a helicopter. Which, by the way, I don't know if it sounds incongruous to ask a man of peace to bless a helicopter, but they did. And the problem turned out to be, among other things, that there's no Latin word for helicopter. They invented one. It's helicopterus, by the way. During the Reagan administration, President Reagan asked the Pope to bless a nuclear missile, which, in my opinion, this is getting pretty out of hand right about there. But the same deal. There's no word for nuclear anything in Latin. I mean, not in the sense of nuclear stuff. So every now and then, and that's my point, Latin isn't truly dead. It is still evolving, but as far as it concerns us, it's dead enough that it works. The other thing that you need to appreciate about Latin is Latin used to be the language of the educated. And for a long time in the history of universities, Latin is what they taught it in. Latin is what you took notes in if you were a student. There are very few schools that still do that to you. I don't know if you knew that Latin used to be the sign of an educated person or an institution, academic institution. And Linnaeus, back in those times, I'm taking you back to the 1700s, Linnaeus was an arrogant man. And the idea that sounding educated really matters, So the idea of doing it in Latin just came natural to him. By the way, his name wasn't really the one you get when you look it up, Carolus Linnaeus. His first name was Carl with a K. He didn't think that sounded educated enough. So he changed it to a Latin version of his actual given name, Carolus. But yeah, Carl, man, he was Carl. His last name wasn't Linnaeus either. He made that up because it sounded Latin and therefore educated. His real name was Carl von Linné. I mention that in part because in your future as biologists, if you ever come across something whose authorship is Linné rather than Linnaeus, same dude, okay? But I like knowing that about him, that his own name just didn't sound, educated or aristocratic enough, so he made up a brand new name for himself. Makes me want to do that, Peterus Panjanus. I don't know. Okay. Linnaeus. Here's where it gets real for you guys. He invented this system of classification based on morphology. Because that's all anybody knew back then. Lions look different from tigers. They're different species. You give them different Latin names. That kind of logic. I've already given you a clue that doing it that way is bound to fail. If you classify by morphology, here's the real story. Sometimes you get it right, because like lions and tigers, they do look different, and that's a clue. And I don't want to say that you luck out, because accidentally you learn that lions and tigers can't interbreed and produce fertile offspring. But you're hearing me say that the system that Linnaeus came up with, and we used it for nearly 300 years, you guys, turns out it doesn't work very well, because it's based on morphology. In my career as a biology watcher, here's what I've noticed. That back around the 70s, people started noticing that if your intent is to classify things in an evolutionary way, and what I mean by that, lions and tigers are closely related. Okay? That's an evolutionary statement. Lions and tigers are closely related. They're members of the same family. In English, that's the cat family. Okay? In Latin, it's the family Felidae, but don't worry about that. That's Linnaeus sounding erudite. So they're members of the same family, sure, but they're not members of the same species. It turns out there's a lot of mistakes in the system that everybody believed in for those couple centuries, where things got classified by morphology. And sometimes it's that things that were distantly related got put in the same category because they accidentally look similar to one another. Sometimes it's that things which are closely related to each other got put in different categories because even though they're closely related, they're not morphologically similar. And starting back in the 70s, those of us that have spent our career watching this happen, people noticed how, man, there's calls in the old system, which you must learn, by the way, because it's still out there. It's in transition now. It's all changing. It's all becoming phylogenetic, the third way of classifying. There is no recourse for you. You have to learn the old classification system. During your careers as a biologist, it's probably going to get phased out so that in the future, people aren't going to be talking about kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, the way Linnaeus set it up. And if those terms are not familiar to you, wait till the next lab, because I'm going to put you through that drill. But just know that it's a doomed system. back in the 70s, people started noticing like serious mistakes. And if it was just a short list of mistakes, you could probably fix that up. But what's happened in the past 30, 40 years is there's more and more examples of things that were classified by morphology where when you do it that way, the outcome is really foolish. And biologists of my generation really fought against changing it, because we're talking about millions and millions of species that are already classified where it's wrong, you know. And long about the 80s and early 90s, there came to be this kind of majority opinion among biologists that, you know, we really do have to throw the Linnaean classification system out and invent a new one. By the way, the new one had already been invented, but the idea was we know how to study living things and get a grip on their relationships. We know how to figure out, are lions and tigers really closely related? What about elephants and lions? Are they closely related or distantly related? What about camels and whales? Are they closely related? Which, by the way, they are. Or are they distantly related? We know how to do it, and DNA science is one of the keys to how you do it and do it right. So nobody's faulting Linnaeus. The kind of evidence that lets you nail this stuff down in exquisite detail wasn't available much before the late 20th century. But now that we have it, it's pretty much universally agreed upon among biologists that there's no alternative. Junk the old system, replace it with a phylogenetic way of classifying. And where I intend to take you over the coming month or so is I'll show you what that means and show you how to work it. For the moment, I want to linger on the biological definition, because that one is still reliably true, the biological definition of a species. If two living things really are members of the same species, then you expect that they can mate and produce fertile offspring. And if you have two individuals like a lion and a tiger where no, they can't produce fertile offspring, then by definition they're members of a different species. That's kind of the gold standard. Hang on to that thought, because it matters. Yeah?
I have a question. Even if it's like the lions and the tiger get together and then they have a baby, and it's like the tiger and lion together, will that offspring make another baby?
No, they're sterile. Were you here last time?
Yeah, but I had this question.
Then read my headline, okay? When you do that thing you just suggested, you do get offspring. And they are sterile. They cannot make babies. By the way, I need you to think about what well, they can make, no, they're sterile. They don't make babies. I need you guys to think about a species this way. Seriously, this is if you want to get phylogenetic, this is the core thought. What a species is really is a gene pool that can perpetuate itself. By gene pool, and use the human example. A gene pool would be if you took all the human genes from all the humans on planet Earth and dump them in a swimming pool. You know, that's a gene pool. It's literally a pool of all the genes that members of your species collectively have. So think about the human species that way. Don't think of it as 7.5 billion human bodies. Think of the human species as there's this quantity of DNA that resides inside of human bodies. And the way you want to think about it is DNA is trying to get to the future. By the way, you're welcome. That thought, write it down. DNA is trying to get to the future. Why is there sex? Not just because it may or may not be fun. Why is there sex? See, DNA wants to go to the future. In the present human gene pool, there's a bunch of DNA that has one overriding ambition. And see, the only way DNA can get to the future is by talking individual members of the species into behaving in such a way that, why do you think sex is so popular?
It's centrally located.
Your DNA wants you to do it, and I mean do it, okay? Because think about it. If you had a species with a gene pool that didn't come with instructions like, y'all better do it because I'm DNA and I want to go to the future, that species would go extinct. I mean, if you think about it, there can be no such thing as a species that fails to reproduce, because it would go extinct and it wouldn't be around for us to talk about. Real species have a drive to reproduce, and it's built into the individual members of the pool, you and me. But seriously, picture what I'm doing for you is I'm distilling a large and complex genetic way of thinking about species into a simple statement of my own invention. You won't find this written down anywhere. DNA wants to go to the future. And the only way it can do it is if individuals who possess DNA copy it and pass it on. So listen, the lions of planet Earth, there is such a thing as the lion gene pool, and the lion gene pool is really good at going from this generation to the next to the next. And the way of it is that individual lions mate with each other and produce fertile offspring. See, that's why the fertile offspring matters. If you've got a living thing, see, you could talk about the ligers of planet Earth, and there's a few dozen of them. They're all in zoos. They have a gene pool, the liger gene pool, but the liger gene pool cannot perpetuate itself. The liger gene pool cannot go to the future because ligers are sterile. It's not just a technicality that what makes a species is that members of that species can produce fertile offspring. That is the game of life. What I am sharing with you are the rules of the game of life. And rule number one is DNA wants to go to the future. And when you consider what a species is, every species has its own collection of DNA, which is separate from the gene pool. Look, tigers have their own gene pool. Lions have their own gene pool. It's two separate pools. Tigers can't get their genes into the lion gene pool. Lions can't get their genes into the tiger gene pool. Now, you can mix lion genes and tiger genes, but what's not happening is that tiger genes are actually getting into the lion gene pool. They're getting into this dead-end situation that we call ligers. A species is a self-perpetuating gene pool, and the fertility of the members of a species really matters. Nearly everything in this course from here on depends on that thing that I just said better make sense to you, okay? DNA wants to go to the future, and it therefore has to cause individual members of a species to do, to have the right biology for getting that thing done. And then it's no good just having reproductive biology, you actually have to employ it, now don't you? Otherwise your DNA is not going to the future. The idea that species have are reproductively isolated. That's the fancy way of putting what I just said. Every species has its own gene pool that's got its own genes in it, and no other species' genes are in. Like the human gene pool has nothing but human genes. If you went out and mated with a sheep or something, don't. But if you went out and mated with a sheep, that's not going to pollute the human gene pool with sheep genes, you know what I mean? Now, if you and a sheep had fertile offspring, that'd be a whole other story, and I would bet that that's not going to happen, okay? I would. I'd be totally confident. So sheep have their own gene pool, unpolluted by human genes. Chimpanzees have their own gene pool, unpolluted by any other species, not just unpolluted by humans. Once you start thinking of a species that way, every species has a gene pool, and every gene pool is isolated from every other gene pool, if you're talking about species. And the phrase you want is reproductive isolation. So here's why it's such a big deal talking about, do you get fertile offspring when one individual mates with another individual? Let's talk about Darwin for a second. The name of his book, his first book, the one the big one, okay, the one that woke the world up and antagonized a bunch of people of faith, okay? The name of that book was On the Origin of Species. It actually started with the word on the origin of species. And it's the one in which he laid out the argument that how evolution happens is by means of natural selection. All that stuff I've been putting you through all semester about, the three things, the way Darwin sized it up, that's from that book, On the Origin of Species. What's weird about that book? Two things. One is he never explained how species originate, even though he called the book On the Origin of Species. He left it as an implication that when you read his book, by the way, it'll put you to sleep. Just if you want good bedtime reading, man, check out Darwin. The man was brilliant, but his prose won't keep you awake. I'm not saying he had no writing skills, but apparently he didn't know how to write with style, you know what I mean, the E.B. White thing. So yeah. The other thing is just a little footnote. In that book, he never used the word evolution, not once. It's a book about evolution, yeah, but he never used that word. By the way, later in his career, in later editions of that book, he changed the last paragraph of the book so that the word evolution was in there. So I can't claim that he never used the word evolution. He kind of held back because he knew people were going to take it as an atheistic proposition. And his hope was that he wanted to educate rather than antagonize. And he figured, that word is going to set people off. Sissy. So listen, back to the title. He never explained in that book how species originate, but he made it perfectly clear. Here's the deal. How you end up with a new species is, what if you have a species and it produces some individuals that are different enough from the original version? Different enough to become a species. Now, see, back when people thought morphological was how you do it, the idea would be that, what if you were born, just real different from the kind, from the species you were born into. That's not really how it works. How it works in such a simple idea, you guys, if you're born different, which all of us are, but what if you're born different in a way that means that you cannot mate and produce fertile offspring with the other members of your species? What if you're born that different? That would qualify you. Well, by the way, if there's just one of you, you're not really a species, but what if there's other individuals with whom you could mate? Other individuals that are weird in the same way you're weird. Memorize the list that's on the screen. Yeah. This is the answer to the question, how different would you have to be? Let's say you're born in one generation and you are different. How different do you have to be to qualify as a new species? And I'm inviting you to think that if you're thinking you got to look different, you have to be morphologically different. I'm inviting you to think that that's not really the way to size this up. What you want to think in terms of is reproductive isolation. What kind of things could be different about you that mean you can't mate with your kind anymore? Let me share an easy one with you, temporal isolation. Populations are isolated because they breed at different times. Listen, let me give you an example, a couple of them. In your backyard, if you're a bird person, you probably already know this. Locally, do y'all know warblers?
The birds.
Yeah, the birds. Yeah, good one. Warblers, man, I'll say this as an aside. Bird people are nuts. I mean, people that take the birder thing seriously. There's people who want to be able to identify every bird that's out there, on site, or by their song if you can't, get a good visual fix on them. There are people whose ambition is to see every species of bird on planet Earth before they die. I mean, there are extreme bird people. Many of them are quite annoying. Many of them, they're not so bad. But listen, here's the thing that the birders. Locally, there are multiple species of warbler. And the thing is, if you're not one of those expert birders, it's really hard to tell them apart. Warblers are basically brown birds with some yellow on them. Small brown birds with yellow on them. And how you tell them apart visually is the patches of yellow. On a lot of warblers, they're different, and if you got binoculars and you have your field guide so you can compare what you see with the book, a lot of them you can identify if you're patient. There's a couple species of warbler, man, good luck if you're not one of those expert birders. Good luck telling who's who. Warblers have pretty little songs, by the way. You've probably heard them. They're reasonably secretive birds. They don't hang out in the open a lot. So to really identify them, a lot of people do it by ear. But I'm just sharing that with you because there's several warbler species probably in your backyard. Okay, here's the thing. Locally, one of the local species nests kind of early to mid-spring, where if you're putting up nest boxes for them, you'd expect to see them then. And another of our local warbler species nests in the summer instead of in the spring. So temporarily, 2 different times a year they mate. This is only going to make sense if I share this fact with you about birds. And man, if you think like a human, here's the thing about if you think that humans are a good example of biology in general, it's kind of weird because in certain ways we are super normal in terms of, the human biology version of whatever it is can be kind of universal. But I'm warning you about this with purpose. There are things about human biology that if you think nature works this way, you'd be badly mistaken. And especially when you start talking about sex. Okay? So let me share a fact about birds and their reproduction. And this anticipates something that after the coming exam, we're going to go deep into this very same thought. See, if you're humans, you've got gonads, right? Gonads are the organs that produce your gametes. So if you're female, what are your gonads? That's your ovaries. If you're male, what are they? Testes, yeah. Okay, those are your gonads. By the way, a lot of people do not realize that gonad is a proper medical term. Yeah, it is. By the way, if you're a baseball fan, which I am, and if you go to Washington National games, which I do, numerous times during the game, people will start just chanting, "Go Nats!" And if you listen carefully, there's people actually yelling, "Go Nats!" And if you watch them on television, you never notice that. It sounds like the crowd's just all yelling, "Go Nats!" But I'm not making this up either, that there's 2 kinds of people who yell, "Go Nats!" in public. And so gonads. Here's the thing. If you're a human, your gonads function year-round, now don't they? If you're a female, you're ovulating. I mean, a vaguely monthly cycle. Doesn't matter what time of year it is. You're making eggs. If you're male, your testes are functional year-round. You're making sperm. Cool. Do you know that most animals don't do it that way? Now you do. Let me tell you how birds do it. And see, some of this is an inference you could draw from lab. Birds have a mating season. The example I just gave you of warblers. Yeah, some species are spring breeders, and other species are summer breeders. This is where it gets weird if you didn't know about this. If I'm a member of the spring breeding species of warbler, here's the deal. If I'm a female, in the spring, my ovaries are just fat and plump and full of eggs, and yeah. And if I'm a male warbler, my testes are just fat and plump and full of sperm. By the way, birds have no scrotum, right? Where are their testes? Yeah. So listen, if you want to find gonads on a bird, what you do is you dissect them. In male birds, the testes would be in the same place the ovaries are in a female, inside your abdominal cavity. Don't think that nature does it like the humans. But listen, the gonad thing. If I'm a spring nester, that's my deal. But it turns out bird gonads are only functional maybe 2 months out of the year. Like during their breeding season, yeah, they're just ready to go. The other 9, 10 months out of the year, they're still in there, but they shrivel up into this little shrunken version of an ovary in the females, or a little shrunken version of the testes in males. And during their off season, which is most of the year, they're not ovulating. The females are not ovulating. The males are not producing sperm cells. Their gonads are just dormant. What will happen if they live till next year's breeding season is like their gonads wake up shortly before breeding season. The ovaries go back to being, fat and plump and full of eggs and just ready to ovulate. The testes go back to being fat and plump and full of sperm cells. But listen, it's a seasonal thing. Start with that. Now think about this. If I'm a spring nesting bird, that's my deal. Now, if I nest in the summer, that's still my deal, only it's a different time of year. So I want you to think about why the spring nesting warblers cannot produce fertile offspring with the summer nesting ones. It's that when the spring females are ready, the summer males are producing no sperm. When the spring males are ready, the summer females are producing no eggs. If you're a member of the summer species, it's the same deal in reverse. These birds are around each other all year long, and yet they cannot produce fertile offspring with each other because of timing, temporal isolation. There are local species of tree that play the same game. I don't know if y'all know witch hazels. Witch hazels are a local medicinal plant. I've got them growing in my yard. But listen, there's a spring nesting version of witch hazel. By the way, plant one. They are the earliest flowering thing locally. And if you know that time of year where you're really tired of winter because everything looks dead and you're just waiting for the first sign of spring, witch hazels, the spring blooming witch hazel is the first of the flowering trees, and I derive a great deal of joy from it. Mine started blooming about, 2.5 weeks ago, and it really is the first sign of spring. It's cool. But listen, flowers are the sex organs of plants. So you know when plants are having sex by observing when they're in bloom. Plants do have sex. Now, locally there's 2 different witch hazels. There's a spring blooming witch hazel. There is a fall blooming witch hazel. They can't mate with each other. They're in each other's neighborhood, and they can be side by side growing in the woods, and yet it is impossible for them to produce fertile offspring. Because when one of them is making eggs and sperm, the other one is not. I should let you in on something else. The definition of a species, the biological definition that, they got to be able to mate, produce fertile offspring. This gets tricky, and I want you to know there's a debate among biologists about how to employ the definition. You could go with, if you just leave them alone out in nature and observe what happens, and the warbler story that I'm telling you would make you conclude that those are 2 different species of warbler. Even though you can't tell them apart, seriously, they're morphologically so similar. Or the 2 species of witch hazel that I'm describing to you. If you just don't mess with them, they never mate with each other. Now, I want you to think about biology tricks, because it turns out you could collect members of those 2 bird species, bring them into a lab, and synchronize them. You know how you do it? With light. You know what gets their ovaries going? Does a bird ovary know whether it's like, spring or summer? It's easy. Their body responds to daylight in that way. It's a hormonal thing in the end. That light has the effect of starting up hormones. And every species has its own story. How much light does it take for that species to get its gonads geared up to produce offspring? So what you can do, you can take a species into the lab, and under artificial light, you can control how long the photoperiod is. And you can actually synchronize the spring nesting species and the summer nesting species. And then just take a male from one, introduce it to a female from the other, and see, will they do it? And by do it, I mean do it. And by do it, I mean, will they produce fertile offspring? And yeah, they do, under artificial laboratory conditions. And here's the debate that biologists, they're never going to resolve this. But you can see the debate, right? Does it count when you're talking about, do they make fertile offspring? Does it count if you can make them do that thing under artificial conditions? Majority opinion among biologists is no, that doesn't count. The definition you want to ride until it drops is what happens in nature. And if the answer is in nature, they don't do it to the point of producing fertile offspring. There's a minority opinion among biologists that that's a really messed up way of looking at it. So I'm not telling you there is a clear-cut answer. I'm honestly reporting majority opinion. And I'll tell you, I side with those who maintain that what really matters is what happens in nature. Because biologists are clever folks. Biologists often know how do you manipulate a species to make things happen that you never see in nature. And for me, that's like, maybe cool biology tricks. But I prefer to look at how nature does it and make the call. So listen, yeah?
Are humans in any way influenced by light and darkness?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Our hormone levels change with the season. Do you know about seasonal affective disorder? SAD? My sister has it bad. Man, don't mess with my sister when the days are short. Okay? And she knows this about herself. She's a danger to herself and others. But it's a photoperiod thing. We make less. The amount of melatonin the human body makes depends on how much sunlight, per day. And short days, you're just really running short of melanin. And it affects mood, it affects behavior, yeah. Now, whether it affects reproductive behavior, my sister are less likely to get lucky in the winter than they are in the summer. You know what I mean? Because she's just a raging, she knows this too, that don't mess with my sister during the winter. By the way, you can remediate that if you are a person with SAD, seasonal affective disorder. Artificial lights can fix your thing up. If you gave yourself, and by the regular old fluorescent lights do not do it. Regular old incandescent lights don't do it. But if you can get grow light kind of light bulbs, the ones that simulate sunlight, they do it. And all you need to do is spend a couple hours a day, when the days are short in the winter, spend enough time in the company of such lights that you're getting a total of 12 or more hours worth of sunlight or fake sunlight. And it remediates your melatonin level, and you end up being a much nicer person in the dead of winter. You do. You do. By the way, my sister, she has such lights, and she's not really faithful. The way people who take it seriously do is just, find a room in your house where you can just sit down, read a good book, watch television for a couple hours with the lights on, and it works for most people. It does. I escaped that thing. It's a genetic thing. My sister has it, I don't. Our mother had it. Bad. But I digress. So temporal isolation. Listen, hang with me for a minute. Because if you were born a mutant, raise your hand. Yeah. Because look, everybody's born a mutant. And the real question is, okay, what genes do you have that are just different? So imagine, and this isn't imagination, the timing of reproduction is controlled by genes. Okay. So then you're down to wondering, man, I wonder if there's such, like if you're one of these bird species or the witch hazels, I wonder if there's such a thing as being born a mutant where your mutation messes with the timing of your reproduction. There are such genes. They have been known to mutate. A change that small, where it's not messing with your morphology. These warblers look hardly at all different from one another. They're not meaningfully different morphologically, but they're different in terms of their timing. And in the end, a single mutation, if it hits just the right gene, can alter the timing of reproduction, so that if you're born with that mutation, you can't mate with the species that you came out of because they're on the old timetable, you got yourself a new one. Question arises, of course, who would you mate with? Your brother or your sister might have that same mutation. Yes, we're talking inbreeding. Yeah. By the way, is it obvious to you that when a species first gets started, there's got to be a whole bunch of inbreeding at the beginning? Yeah. If you take the Genesis thing to be true. By the way, there's a rabbi friend of mine who says this about the book of Genesis. Doesn't matter if that thing is literally true. It doesn't matter if there was a guy named Adam. Doesn't matter if there was a woman named Eve, because there is deep truth in there, whether or not that's true. And what he says the deep truth is, the story of Genesis that matters, is that all the humans came from some original humans. All of us are family because we are all descended from the original ones. All the rest is just details. That's the deep truth. But think about it, because seriously, if the Adam and Eve thing were true, they had kids, right? Who were they? Oh, a couple boys. Who'd they mate with?
Mom, I don't know.
Seriously, who'd they mate with?
Mom.
Because they kept the species going now, didn't they? Because we're here. Okay, there must have been some incest going on in the beginning. By the way, the translation, the King James Version, the Bible version that most people are acquainted with, that thing's been edited. You know that there are entire books of the Bible that have been removed over the ages. Yeah. And there are sections of certain books that are still in there that have been edited where there's detail used to be in there that's not there. Did you know that? Yeah. Look it up. It's not my job to teach you Bible history, but yeah. There are other versions of that Bible where there were girl children of Adam and Eve. Now, why they got weeded out of the story we're all familiar with, that's a long story, the motives. And we're talking the Vatican, basically. And whoever knows the motives of the Vatican. But I'm just saying, they might have had sisters, in which case, who'd they mate with? Yeah. Or if they didn't have sisters, that's like, ooh. Because you're down to, Mom, I wish to achieve fitness. And you're the only game in town, So listen, deep truth about species is that when they get started, you're going to have a small number of individuals who are the founders. Ooh, founder effect. Okay, there's going to be a small number of individuals, usually. There are scenarios where perhaps it's a bigger group. I'll talk you through some of those later. But a common way that any species would get started is sort of the way the book of Genesis hands it down about us. That once upon a time there was a small number of founding individuals who gave rise to generation after generation. And inbreeding is just kind of a fact of life in that situation. So when I say not so rhetorically, if I were born different, I'm a bird, everybody else in my species mates in April and I'm August, I'm out of luck unless some other individual with the same rare mutation as me happens to be in my neighborhood. And because genes run in families, the answer to where would you find a member of the opposite sex with whom you could produce fertile offspring might be right there in your own family. Okay? Temporal isolation is one of the easy ones to think about. And for me, it gives you big clues to why you don't want to trust morphology. The changes don't have to be physical. The changes don't have to be visible. The changes don't have to be morphological. All that matters is, can you change some detail about your biological self that means you can't fulfill the definition of species with your old kind. You can't mate and produce fertile offspring.
I guess 25 or 30 years ago, they found a fossil in Africa and they named it Lucy.
Yeah.
And some call her, I think of her as Eve. What do you think?
Morphologically, she was not one of us biologically modern humans. She's clearly related to us. And further back in time, Lucy goes back about 4.3 million years. And modern humans, we're talking less than 500,000 years that we've been around. So she's probably representative of before there were humans, there were ancestors. And she's probably in that tribe of potential ancestors. A lot of human features, but clearly not exactly a human. Let me, in the time remaining, because this is kind of cool. Mechanical isolation, which is sort of a strange adjective to use. Matings fail because male and female reproductive structures are incompatible. That's a highly polite way of saying their parts don't fit together. I'm talking about your external genitalia.
A pig.
Or, pig genitalia. Have any of you guys ever seen a pig penis? Seriously? Has anybody ever seen a pig penis? First of all, big. Second of all, shaped like a corkscrew. Okay? Would it surprise you to learn that pig vaginas are shaped like a corkscrew on the inside? Because if you think about copulation, the need for male parts to fit well with female parts is kind of obvious. By the way, if you think you know what male genitalia look like because you've seen some human male genitalia, you do not know what genitalia look like when you're talking about nature. Okay? By the way, male possums have a forked penis. It's got two tips. Did you know that? Would it surprise you to learn that female possums have a forked vagina?
Wow.
They do.
That is so cool.
Form and function, yeah. And see, the thing about mating, and this is one of nature's most popular isolating mechanisms, genitalia have to be able to fit together in a way that leads to successful reproduction. And I'm talking specifically about species that have sex by copulating. And you already know about sex diet on the coral reef. This doesn't apply to every species. But in species that are actually going to do it in the sense of copulating, yeah. The best examples are from insects. Insect genitalia tend to be really complex in the way of, jigsaw puzzle pieces where you can have two pieces that almost go together but they don't really fit. You know that thing. In insect species, most insects have genitalia that are these custom crafted, complex looking things where the male parts of one species will not fit with the female parts, even of closely related insect species. By the way, well, first of all, just know that one of the ways you can get a new species is, what if you were born different in a way that your parts are the mutant difference that distinguish you, your external genitalia? That could lead to you're not a member of that old species anymore because you can no longer mate and produce fertile offspring with them. And again, if the question is where might you find a compatible partner with whom your parts would fit, very likely within your own family group, because genes run in families. If you didn't already know this, let me share a cool fact with you. When you compare one species to another, and you could do this over millions of species, do you know what the most distinctive part of the anatomy of pick some random species. The part which is most distinctive so that you wouldn't confuse that with some other species. Do you happen to know? It's the sex organs. It's the sex organs, and once you get it, that this is the game nature is playing, that a species is made up of individuals who can mate with each other, but who are isolated from all those other gene pools of all those other species. Yeah, the genitalia, and this is true in flowers. In flowering plants, flowers are the sex organs. And it turns out the flowers of a plant are the most distinguishing feature, the thing which is most different when you compare one species with another. In the animal kingdom, genitalia, male parts, female parts, are the most distinctive, the most, as they say, species-specific morphological detail. That's what I said earlier. If you think you know penises and what they look like because you've seen some human penises, that's just the human version. Thank you for bringing up pigs, by the way. And that made me bring up possums. That's the thing. And I don't know if you've ever spent much time looking at animal genitalia. It's highly educational, not to mention interesting, and not to mention fun. But both male parts and female parts are that different. I have a great story about job opportunities that I'll share with you next time we convene, because this actually leads to some serious classification stuff. But for now, spring break.